There are losses in professional sports that sting. There are losses that frustrate. And then there are losses that demand an entirely different conversation. The kind of conversation that does not allow for deflection, does not permit the comfortable retreat into "it was a tough night" or "we'll bounce back," and does not let a single decision-maker escape the direct, unambiguous weight of what just happened. What the Indiana Fever produced in this game is the third kind of loss. Not because the margin was devastating, not because the talent gap was exposed, but because the numbers that surround this result make it statistically, competitively, and analytically impossible to explain through any lens other than coaching failure. And that conversation starts with one number, a number so stark, so brutal in its implications, that everything else in this breakdown flows directly from it. The opposing team shot 2 of 18 from three-point range, 11%. Let that settle for a moment before moving forward, because the full weight of that number requires genuine comprehension to appreciate what it means in the context of a competitive, professional basketball game. 11% from three is not a cold shooting night. It is a rough stretch that evens out over a full game. It is historically catastrophic offensive execution. Professional basketball players at every level of the sport convert three-point attempts at rates that hover between 33 and 40% under normal competitive conditions. 11% is not a cold night. It is nearly 3 times worse than what random chance would produce if you handed the ball to someone with no basketball training and told them to shoot from the perimeter. The opposing offense was not just struggling, it was failing at a level that the sport almost never produces at the professional tier, and Indiana lost. Stephanie White had her team in position with a 12-point lead, a historically disarmed opponent, and 40 minutes of professional basketball to close out a game that the numbers said should not have been closable from the other side. The lead vanished, the game was surrendered, and the only place the accountability for that outcome can honestly land is on the person who designed the system, made the rotations, managed the personnel, and oversaw every decision across those 40 minutes. That person is Stephanie White, and the examination of exactly how and why this happened is what the rest of this breakdown is going to deliver. Before getting into the specific failures, it is worth establishing exactly what kind of coach Stephanie White is supposed to be, because the gap between the expectation and the reality is itself part of the story. White came into this role with a reputation, experience at the collegiate level, familiarity with the WNBA system, and understanding of what professional women's basketball demands from a tactical standpoint. The Indiana Fever did not hand her this job without reason. They handed her a roster that, once Caitlin Clark arrived, transformed almost overnight into one of the most watched, most discussed, and most scrutinized teams in the entire league. The eyes of professional basketball, and millions of eyes far beyond the traditional WNBA audience, landed on this franchise and stayed there. What those eyes have watched, game after game, is a coaching arrangement that consistently finds ways to make a talented roster perform below the ceiling its best player should be elevating it toward. This game was not an isolated incident. It was the clearest, most statistically undeniable version of a pattern that has been building across this entire season's evidence. And the 11% shooting performance from the opponent is the number that strips away every possible excuse and forces the pattern into the light where it cannot be ignored. Let us start where this story actually starts, with how Caitlin Clark is deployed within this offensive system, because that deployment is the single most consequential coaching decision this staff makes in every game they play. This is not a subjective claim. It is not fan enthusiasm overstating a rookie's importance. It is the direct, observable, statistically confirmed reality of what happens to this offense depending on whether Clark is operating as the central, organized force the system is built around, or whether the system routes possessions away from her and through other players. When Clark is the initiated presence in this offense, when she is reading the defense, distributing the ball, receiving it back in rhythm, and functioning as the designed primary playmaking option, Indiana is a genuinely difficult team to defend. She sees the floor at a level that creates problems for opposing defenses that simply do not exist when the ball is moving through other hands. She draws attention that opens space. She creates hesitation in defensive rotations that produces the extra half second other players need to operate effectively. She is, without extended analytical debate required, the engine. When that engine is running with proper fuel and proper design, this team moves. When it is not, this team stalls. In this specific game, observers who tracked possessions from start to finish documented the pattern repeatedly and consistently. Clark would initiate the offensive action, she would set a screen for a teammate, distribute the ball to create a scoring opportunity, read the defense and make the correct first pass, and then, rather than cycling back to her as the designed primary option, the possession would terminate elsewhere. She was not the constructed endpoint of the plays being run. The ball was not finding its way back to her in the rhythm that elite offensive players require to build momentum, develop shooting confidence, and sustain the production volume this team depends on her to generate. That is not a player making bad decisions. That is a coaching system organized in a way that removes its own best weapon from the moments where that weapon is most dangerous. The result of that structural coaching decision, that choice about how this offense is built and how possessions are designed to flow, was Caitlin Clark shooting 4 of 14 from the field in 34 minutes of professional basketball. 4 of 14. The most capable offensive player on this roster in a game Indiana was losing, in a game that demanded maximum offensive production, converted 4 of her 14 field goal attempts. And while that shooting percentage is painful enough on its own, it is not even the most damning number in her line from this game. The most damning number is 0. 0 free throw attempts in 34 minutes of professional basketball. Sit with that for a moment, because it deserves the same kind of genuine comprehension as the 11% three-point shooting number did. Stephanie White runs an offensive system that so infrequently puts Clark in positions to attack the basket with force, to drive into contact, to operate in the aggressive downhill manner that produces the foul calls professional referees are required to acknowledge, that Clark went 34 full minutes in a competitive game, a game Indiana was losing and needed production to win, without earning a single trip to the free throw line. Not one. 0. From a player shooting 100% from the free throw line for the entire season entering this game. Free throws are the most reliable, most efficient, and most controllable scoring mechanism available in basketball. They are not defended. They are not contested. They reward exactly the kind of aggressive basket attack that Clark is capable of generating when the system puts her in the right positions. And the system did not put her there, not once across 34 minutes. What makes that 0 even more impossible to absorb quietly is what was happening at the other end of the floor during those same 34 minutes. Indiana accumulated 27 foul calls assessed against them across 40 minutes of this game. 27. The team that could not get its best player to the free throw line a single time was simultaneously being whistled for fouls at a volume that tells its own story about the physical and competitive nature of how this game was played. That asymmetry, 27 fouls called against Indiana, 0 free throw attempts generated by Clark, is not a footnote. It is the coaching indictment written directly into the official box score in permanent ink. When your team absorbs that volume of foul calls while your best player earns 0 trips to the line, the offensive system has structurally failed to place that player in the positions where the rules of basketball are specifically designed to reward her.
Clark attacks the basket when properly positioned. Clark generates contact when operating with the ball handling continuity her game requires. The system Stephanie White designed, installed, and executed in this game did not create those positions for her. That is not an accident of opponents scheming. Elite defenses scheme to take away what you do. What they cannot scheme away entirely is a coaching system specifically designed to create those opportunities through structure, through play design, through the organized actions that put your best player in positions to operate on her terms, rather than the defense's. The system did not generate those positions. The zero is the proof. Now we arrive at the specific coaching failure that most directly and most measurably converted a 12-point lead into a competitive loss: foul trouble management. When Clark accumulated fouls in this game, the dynamic of the entire contest shifted in a way that was immediately visible and immediately consequential. The 12-point lead that Indiana had built, the advantage that should have been not just maintained, but extended against an opponent shooting 11% from three, began contracting the moment Clark's foul situation changed her ability to compete freely and aggressively. That contraction did not stabilize. It continued, and the lead that had reached 12 points disappeared entirely by the time the final buzzer confirmed what the second half's evidence had been telegraphing. That correlation, Clark in foul trouble, lead evaporating, is not a coincidence requiring statistical investigation to validate. It is the most consistent and most repeatedly confirmed pattern across this entire season's body of evidence. It is what happens to this team when its engine is restricted. Every professional basketball coach operating at a competitive level understands this principle without needing it explained. When your most important player accumulates foul trouble while you are holding an advantage, your coaching responsibility is specific, immediate, and non-negotiable. You manage her exposure. You design the offensive structure to maintain the lead through mechanisms that do not require her to compete in ways that produce additional whistles. You protect the competitive advantage she helped create by making the deliberate adjustments that preserve her availability and her freedom to compete without restriction through the moments when the game outcome is actually being decided. Those adjustments require recognizing the situation, understanding what the lead means, and making decisions that prioritize sustaining the advantage over whatever the default structural tendencies of your system would otherwise produce. The competitive result of this game tells us about Stephanie White's response to Clark's foul trouble situation is direct and uncomplicated. The lead disappeared. The game was lost to a team shooting 11% from three. Whatever adjustments were or were not made in that critical stretch were insufficient to protect the advantage that Clark's presence had helped build, and the coaching decisions surrounding her foul management in those decisive minutes are directly and inseparably connected to that outcome.
Kelsey Mitchell's role in this game needs its own section of this accountability examination, because how Mitchell is deployed, what responsibilities she carries within this system, and what ball distribution principles govern her role are coaching design decisions, not organic player behavior that exists independently of the structure she operates within. Mitchell finished this game with 21 points, 2 assists, and 4 turnovers. 21 points sounds productive until the full line comes into focus. 2 assists, 4 turnovers. In a game where every single possession carried direct competitive relevance to whether a 12-point lead was maintained or surrendered, Mitchell was literally twice as likely to give the ball directly to the opposing team as she was to create a scoring opportunity for a teammate. That ratio is not a player having a rough distribution night. That ratio, sustained across this game in a losing effort against an opponent that could not make three-pointers, is a structural offensive failure with coaching origins. Players operate within the systems their coaches build, reinforce through film sessions, and reward through role assignment and rotation decisions. When coaching staffs consistently create individual shot creation opportunities for a player, routes possessions through her in isolation, designs actions that terminate in her individual reads rather than in the ball movement principles that produce assists and fewer turnovers,
The coaching staff is not just enabling that tendency, they are building it into the foundation of how the offense functions. Mitchell's 4-turnover, 2-assist performance in a losing game against an 11% three-point shooting is the direct output of how Stephanie White has organized this offense and what she has asked Mitchell to do within it. Observers watching this game documented specifically and repeatedly that open players were being passed over because the ball was staying in the hands of individual creators, rather than moving to the open teammate positioned to convert. In a game where Indiana needed to sustain a 12-point lead against an opponent that could not make three-pointers, the wide-open perimeter looks being abandoned for contested individual creation were precisely the scoring opportunities that maintaining and extending the lead required converting. The defense was communicating exactly where the ball should go. It was moving its attention, leaving players open, creating the exploitable gaps that ball movement offense exists to find and punish. The structure did not generate the movement that would have located those open shootings. The possessions that terminated in contested individual attempts and the 4 turnovers were possessions that a better designed, better installed offensive system would have redirected toward higher percentage collective outcomes. This is the core of what makes White's offensive design structurally deficient. The system generates individual creation situations and relies on those individual creators to produce sufficient scoring volume through personal shot making. When the individual creation fails, 4 turnovers, 2 assists, a losing effort, there is no structural corrective mechanism built into the design that routes the offense toward good shots automatically. The system has no way to catch its own breakdowns. When the primary mechanism fails, the failure compounds rather than self-corrects. The defensive rebounding situation in this game adds a dimension to the coaching accountability picture that cannot be left unaddressed. Indiana surrendered 34 defensive rebounds in this game. 34. That number is not a one-game aberration that can be attributed to a specific matchup disadvantage or an unusual size advantage. It has appeared in this team's defensive statistics with a consistency across this season that classifies it not as a variance, but as a structural vulnerability, a persistent, unresolved weakness in how this team is organized and coached to compete for defensive boards. What 34 defensive rebounds surrendered means in the context of this specific game is particularly significant. An opponent shooting 11% from three-point range was, by the mathematics of that shooting performance, generating missed shots at a relentless rate throughout the game. Every one of those misses was an opportunity for Indiana to secure possession, end the opponent's offensive sequence, and begin their own. Every offensive rebound the opponent converted instead was a possession that should not have existed, a second chance for an offense whose primary weapon was failing catastrophically, a continuation of a sequence that Indiana's defense should have terminated. Those extended possessions were competitive oxygen. They kept an offense alive that should have been suffocating under the weight of its own shooting failures. And they were produced not by Indiana's inability to position itself for defensive boards, but by a coaching staff that has not solved the rebounding vulnerability through scheme installation, rotational adjustment, or any mechanism that has produced consistent defensive board control across this season's evidence. Securing your own basket after a missed shot is the most foundational defensive execution principle in basketball. Against a team shooting 11% from three-point range, failing to execute that principle consistently across 40 minutes is not a talent problem. It is a preparation and scheme problem. It belongs to the coaching staff.
There is one more dimension of this game that deserves placement in the coaching accountability conversation before the complete picture is assembled, and it is the officiating dimension. Not because the officials are responsible for this loss, but because how coaches prepare their teams to compete within the officiating environment they are going to face is itself a coaching responsibility that belongs in this examination. 27 fouls called against Indiana in a single professional basketball game. That volume reflects a team competing either with a physical aggressiveness that produces legitimate foul calls in the normal course of physical basketball, or with a defensive positioning and contact discipline that generates unnecessary and avoidable whistles through undisciplined bodily commitment to plays. Coaches prepare players for how to compete physically within the boundaries of how games are officiated, the philosophy of defensive contact, the principles of positioning that avoid unnecessary body-to-body commitment in vulnerable situations, the habits of contest without foul that professional-level coaching installs through repetition and accountability. These are coaching inputs. 27 fouls called against Indiana in a game they were losing while their best player accumulated 0 free throw attempts in the opposite direction is not a random officiating outcome. It reflects a team competing in ways that its coaching staff has either explicitly designed or failed to correct. And in a game where foul management of the team's best player was already the most critical competitive variable, absorbing 27 fouls in the opposite direction amplified every other failure on this list. What emerges when every element of this game is placed together and examined as a complete coaching accountability picture is comprehensive, analytically unambiguous, and impossible to explain through any single isolated factor. An offensive system that structurally removed Clark from the ball flow her game requires and produced 4 of 14 shooting from the most capable offensive player available. A foul management approach that failed to protect the lead-building player from the foul accumulation that directly produced the competitive collapse. A ball distribution scheme organized around a player who generated 4 turnovers against 2 assists in 40 minutes of losing basketball against an opponent that could not convert from the perimeter. A defensive scheme that surrendered 34 offensive rebounds to a team desperately in need of extended possessions because its primary scoring mechanism was collapsing in real time. And a 12-point lead that completely and entirely disappeared against an opponent that shot 2 of 18 from three-point range. Every single element of that picture traces back to one person. Every structural decision, every scheme installation, every rotation call, every offensive design principle, every defensive accountability standard, they all belong to Stephanie White. They all contributed, not in isolation, not in combination with some external factor that White could not have anticipated or controlled, but directly and measurably to producing a loss that the talent level of this roster should not have been capable of generating against that opponent on that night. What makes this particularly pointed is what Caitlin Clark continues to do despite the structural environment this coaching arrangement has built around her. She has extended all-time WNBA records this season in multiple historical categories. In games where her shooting is limited by the system's failure to put her in the right positions, she produces 9 assists and 7 rebounds. She carries this team through individual stretches of brilliance that no coaching staff at any professional level should be comfortable absorbing as a substitute for structural excellence. She is doing everything a generational player can do within a system that consistently finds ways to constrain rather than amplify what she is capable of. She cannot override a coaching design that removes her from the ball flow her game depends on. She cannot reverse the competitive damage produced when foul management decisions leave her restricted in the moments that decide game outcomes. She cannot individually correct a ball distribution scheme that enables 4 turnover, 2 assist performances from primary rotation players. She cannot personally solve a defensive rebounding vulnerability that the coaching staff has not resolved across an entire season of evidence. What she can do, and what she continues to do, is produce at a historical level despite every structural obstacle this coaching arrangement places in her path. And that sustained excellence in the face of those obstacles is not a reason for the coaching staff to feel comfortable. It is an indictment of what is being wasted. 12-point lead, 11% three-point shooting from the opponent, 0 free throw attempts for Clark, 27 fouls called against Indiana, 34 defensive rebounds surrendered. A loss. Those numbers are Stephanie White's coaching record from this game, not partially hers, not hers in combination with bad luck or unfortunate variance or opponent execution that no coach could have anticipated. Entirely, directly, and measurably hers. The talent on this roster is capable of something significantly better than what these decisions have produced. The fans who have invested financially, emotionally, and organizationally in this franchise, many of them entirely new to the WNBA because of what Caitlin Clark represents, deserve competitive management that reflects the seriousness and the significance of those investments. In Clark herself, who is producing the kind of output that belongs in the permanent historical record of the sport, despite every structural constraint this coaching arrangement has placed around her, deserves a system designed to amplify what she does, rather than one that consistently finds ways to work against it. The gap between what this team is capable of being and what Stephanie White's decisions have made it, that gap is the precise, measurable cost of every coaching choice that has been made this season. And until the decisions change, the gap remains, and the losses that should not have been possible will keep happening.